Hi everyone, welcome to week 2 of the Unreal Engine Specialization. Today we're going to be going over objects, materials, and prototyping. And I'm going to try and at least for these first few tutorials give you one part that is environment and art based, and then another part that is more blueprint focused, so that everyone in the class who has different sort of tastes and interests gets a little bit of everything. So first off, I've dropped back into this same environment that we were in last week. And what I've done is I've just deleted my character blueprint and all of my inputs, because I want to show you how you can take the work that you've already done and reuse that in other projects if you were to start setting this up as a new level. So what I actually did was I went into my blueprint, which I had already set up, and we'll open up the content browser. And I actually haven't deleted these yet. So I took everything that was inside here and then pressed Command C, or Control C, sorry. And I pasted that into a document. So this is what my document looked like. It's quite long, and this is essentially all of the actual code that is making up our blueprint. So this is my first person controller, and all I need to do to actually bring this back in is Control C on that doc, and I'll upload the document so you've got that there on canvas. And I'm just going to delete these two. Force delete, whatever. So we'll create a new blueprint. We'll create a new blueprint class of the character parent class, and we'll just call it FPS controller, and we should probably name it BP underscore. And what I can do is actually just open that up, head over to my event graph here, and I can select all, delete that, and paste that in, and straight away I've got the entire event graph that I'd already set up back in. From there, I just need to plug in my inputs again. So all I need to do, and we can actually see that these are giving me a bit of a warning message saying we need this move forward input and this move rightward. Same with the jump and the looking. So we just need to go back in and add in these inputs. So I'm going to go back to my edit project settings, go over to the inputs tab, and then we'll just remap these axes. Okay, so I've just remapped all of those different inputs. Here they are again if you want to pause and do the same. What you can also do is export this as a config file, and then you could save that on your own drive or something like that, and then you could re-import those settings yourself. Okay. So now that I've got all those inputs plugged back in, I can just hit compile again, and you can see that all of those different input events are now happy, so that's good. It looks like event on jump. Looks like I have this one actually wrong, so just be careful on the copy. That shouldn't be event on jumped. It should be jump action event here, input action jump. So just be careful on that one. And then these ones, I'm also missing 2 variables. So we can just go ahead and create those again. So we are going to need the sprint speed, which is a float, and the sprint, and the default speed. Okay, so we've got both of those values, and then I will need to compile and just plug in something here. So we'll get 600 for the default, and then 1000 Sorry, that's the other way around. 600 for the default and then 1000 for the sprint speed. And we'll compile those. Are these happy yet? They're not. I might just delete and bring those back in. And why that is these actually, I entered a space bar when it should have just been capitalized. Okay, let's see, compile. We've got the click, we're no longer dirty, so that is good. The other thing I need to do is also just add in a camera. So we'll come back to our viewport here and add in a camera. So this is on our blueprint controller again. I'm just going to dock that here. And then we just need to drop that back into our scene and also make sure that we've ticked possession. So we're going to possess as player 0. And we're going to tick camera. So these are under the settings for pawn, I believe. Yes, pawn. And use controller rotation pitch. There we go. Now we should be able to hit play. And yes, we've got our character working as it was in the last week. And that's most of the work just done by re-importing what we had already done. Okay, great. So the next tool I want to show you is kind of part a prototyping tool, but also part an environment art tool, and that is called the Cubegrid tool. This is a really great tool to build out our initial environments, and then we can layer in our more complicated elements later. But it's great for doing stuff like gray boxing, and it's just a really friendly iterative tool to start building out your environments, specifically your more built or man-made looking structures. So to start using the Cubegrid tool, we need to go over to the top left here and click on our selection mode, and you can see there's actually a lot of different modes that we can enter here. So today we're going to go through some of the modeling toolkit, which includes the Cubegrid tool. And we're also going to go through and do some mesh painting later. So first off, we'll open up our modeling toolkit, and you see we get this new little window that pops up on the side here. And this is basically a set of tools that we can use to start doing some modeling in our scene. So we might go over to this end of our lake here where we've got a bit of space, and we're going to click on the Cubegrid tool that's under Poly Model here. And you can see now I've started to get this selection window when I drag my mouse around, and we can do that actually off any of these surfaces. One thing I will point out is just make sure you've not got anything selected here when you do first click Cubegrid. Otherwise you're going to start building a Cubegrid off of one of those items, which is maybe something you don't want to do. So with our Cubegrid tool selected, we're going to be able to draw out a grid. So I'm going to select quite a big space, something like that. And now we can start pushing and pulling. This really reminds me of using Google SketchUp in the early days, but it's got kind of a nice grid system that it's snapping to. So what we can do is we can use the E key, and that will pull up, or we can push down or away with the Q key. The other way we can start moving this grid is if we hold down Control and click, and then we can just sort of drag up and down. So I'm going to drag out sort of monstrous plinth here. And then what we can do is make a new selection. And let's, I guess, make some sort of three-sided box. And we can make a new selection on the top, and then we can drag that. Oops, I'm using the Command key on this Mac keyboard on a Windows computer. So we can make a new selection and then hold Control, and then we can then drop that down. and already we've just created a room, which is pretty great to have this just built in and we can start working. Now we might want to start creating some interesting terrain, and maybe we make a little sort of space to do some 3D platforming around in. So we might want to pull out a sort of path along this wall. So I'm just using control again and dragging that out. We can maybe have a space that the player has to jump over here. So we'll do something like that. And then we could have a incline here. And I think there's a few ways we could do that. So we can make another cut out like that. And we can do another one like this. And then we can actually use the corner mode by selecting some faces like that and pressing Z. And then we can select two corners and drag those out as well, like so. And to exit corner mode, once we've done that, we can just press Z again and we go back to this mode. So we can start pulling out some shapes and making some ramps. This is going to be a bit of a funny looking one, but it's alright. And you can see as we do that, we do have UVs happening already, which is these sort of cubes. You can see I just made a bit of an ugly stretch, but it doesn't matter too much. And so we will just start dragging some things out here. And again, I'm just pushing Z to enter the corner mode here and then dragging out different shapes. And that looks good. That works with like a large selection. Another thing we can do while we're modeling is resize our cube grid. So we can press Control Q here to kind of shrink our grid, and then we can press Control E to increase it. So if you wanted to have some more detailed work, well, you could do that as well. So we could start, start pulling out some different smaller shapes as well. And then you could go bigger and pull out something like that. Okay, so I've created some sort of interesting space here with some different cutouts, and we've started to create some different shapes in here as well to break up kind of the monotony of this shape. But you can go through and add as much detail as you really want. Once you are happy with your cube grid, just go ahead and hit the accept button down here, and that will now turn into a committed piece of geometry. And just like any other primitive or actor, we can move that around and rescale it. And then if we wanted to go back, we can just make sure we've got that selected and go back to our cube grid tool. And we can start going back and working on the same grid. You will notice if you did move it around or rescale your grid though, you sort of lose your perfect snapping. So just keep that in mind if you do go ahead and do that. Okay. Another really useful thing in the modeling toolkit is some of these basic shapes and booleans as well. So what we can do is, if we make sure we're deselected from the actual cube grid, we can create a new object. So let's go ahead and do maybe a cylinder. And then we can choose where we want to draw in a cylinder. And we've got some options here, so we can increase the radius of it. And it's really good to be able to see the actual UV coordinates while we do that. And we can sort of move that around. But so I might make this like a window that we're going to cut out of this cube grid. So maybe Yeah, that looks pretty good. It's like a port window here where we jump over. And I'll just make sure that that's intersecting and sticking out here, and we'll accept that. I might also just add in some more slices so we've got a bit more resolution to work with. And we'll hit accept. So then what we could do is, with our cylinder selected, we could come through and have a look at some of the different deformers, and you can do this on literally any mesh that you've imported. It doesn't have to be a primitive. But we could use something like our dynamic sculpting here and give that a sec to cache, and then we could start pulling some shapes into this. And really I'm going to want to focus my attention on this area because this is going to be our Boolean here. And we can increase the sort of size of our brush and the strength as well. And we'll just give that a bit of movement. So something like that. We hit accept. And now we could go and select both of these and do a mesh bool on it. So we'll come over to the poly model settings here and use the mesh bool operator. And you'll see now we've just subtracted the cube grid from the cylinder, but we actually want to do the opposite. So I'm just going to change our operation from A minus B to B minus A and hit accept. And now we've got a hole through our wall that we just created. Really easy, and it's completely dynamic. So we could go back in and create more around here, and this is all in editor, no 3D modeling software needed. What I might do now is import a Quixel material and just apply that here so we've got something to look at. So I'm just going to return back to our selection mode here, and now we can select this Boolean object as well. It kind of deleted our original input, by the way, but we could have changed those settings if we did want to. And so we'll rename this one to Cubegrid somewhere. Edit, rename. And I'm just going to apply a texture I just downloaded from Quixel, and that's this concrete texture. So I'm going to drop that down here. And that is extremely tiled, so we'll need to fix that as well. Now, one thing we can do instead of actually changing the tiling directly is we can go ahead and UV map this object as well. So we could do just like an auto UV, see what it does there. That looks pretty terrible, so maybe let's just do a box projection. So I'll choose box, and that looks a bit better there. And then we can also change our scale here, so we can rescale that one. So I think about a 1.5 scale is looking pretty good. All right, great. So I'm going to accept that. And that way, that just means that we've got pretty even texture UVs, and we didn't have to go in and change the actual tiling on the texture. So if we were using that texture in multiple different contexts, we haven't gone and adjusted that material directly. I might want to change my lighting a little bit so we can get some nice light coming through that hole that we made. So something like that, I think, looks pretty nice. Okay. That looks good to me. And so now over here we've got this massive building here that we can run around in with some concrete. It's looking great. Let's see if we can make this jump. We can. These, I've made it a little bit too steep for our character to naturally be able to walk up it, but maybe that's okay. Oh. Wow, it really doesn't want me to jump up there. Oh, there we go. Right. So that was the Cubegrid tool, and that's a really easy tool to start playing around with if you want to set up some different looking environments, especially when you want to build out your interiors. And, you know, it is a prototyping tool. It's not designed for your final environments, but I think you could definitely use it, especially if you weren't going for something super hi-fi. It really works for these really concrete, brutalist aesthetics as well. So the next thing we're going to do is import some objects from outside of the Unreal Quixel Megaverse. So what we're going to do is jump over to the canvas shell and download a barrel material and model that I've got up there. If you do have something on your PC that you want to use yourself, go for it. All you need is your mesh and the accompanying textures for this part of the tutorial. If you do want to use mine, just jump onto the canvas. Okay, so I've just downloaded that file from Canvas, and we've got a normal map, roughness map, albedo map, displacement, as well as the actual FBX file itself. So what I'm going to do is just select the ones I want, which is going to be the albedo, barrel, roughness, and normal. And then we'll create a new folder inside of our content under the mesh, and we'll call this the barrel folder. Wouldn't be a game without barrels. And we'll drag in those files there. Now you will get this import pop-up. So we've got a few different options here. One is if we want to use nanite or not. So for this one, I'm going to tick true. And if we want to import the textures, which we're going to do, of course, I believe we can also choose if we want to generate our, where is it? Up here. So we can choose if we want to generate collision as well, so that's automatically ticked on. So we're just going to hit import all there. And now, after I close all those pop-ups, we've got our barrel. Okay, so we've got our barrel here, and we're going to drag that into our scene. And now we probably need to scale that up. It's a bit small as well, so we'll zoom in here and just drag that up. But we've got one problem, which is that our material didn't drop in automatically, as it won't. So we've got all of our texture channels here. Now we need to figure out how we're going to create a material that captures all those different texture channels. So to create a material for this barrel, we're going to open up our content browser again and right-click in the empty space and choose material. And we'll just call this m_barrel. And we'll double click that to open it up. Now you'll see we'll get all of these different material channels that have opened up. So what we'll need to do is grab all of our different texture channels here and drop those into our blueprint here. And we'll just arrange these a little bit. That's looking good. By the way, if you want to kind of snap things around in the blueprint space, you can hit Shift D and that'll snap things to the right, or you can hit Shift A and that'll snap things all to the left. So that's just a nice way to keep things tidy. So we could just connect up all of these different channels. So we can grab our diffuse channel, our normal, attach it to the normal, and our I believe this was roughness, and attach it to the roughness here. And if we wanted to preview this on the barrel itself, what we need to do is open up our content browser again and just highlight our barrel and then hit this sort of 3D brick. And that's going to pull in that nice object that we had there. And if I hit apply here, that should then show us our material on the barrel. So that's looking good. If we come back to our scene here, we need to also apply the barrel texture here. So we could do that by dragging and dropping the texture here. But what I actually want to do is set the default material of the barrel to be that new one we just created. So all we need to do is double click the static mesh and come up to the material here and just pick our new barrel material. And we'll save that. It's looking good. I think this is going to be a bit big, so I'm going to scale that back down, something like that. Great. Okay, so we've got our barrel. Now we might want to start working with that texture and figure out how we can start playing around and customizing it, because right now it's very straightforward. So we could start doing something like multiplying our texture. So if I hold Control and drag off this point, I can grab that plug and drop it here. And I could type multiply. And now we're multiplying that texture by this value here, and then we can connect that to the base color. So you see at a value of 1, that doesn't really do anything, but we could set that to, say, 0.1 and apply that. And if we come back here now, we've kind of turned it mostly black and we're not getting much of the color, but still, you know, a little bit is coming through, and we can play with that value. So that's one thing we can do. We could do the same thing for our roughness here. So instead of using this texture channel, which I believe is, it does have a little bit of color to it, but not a huge amount. But we could also just multiply that one. So Control again, multiply, drop that roughness in there. This time we might want to make this a really low value like that. Bring that up to 1 again. Hit apply. And you can see that now we've got a sort of wet looking barrel. It's not very rough, and it's been emphasized on the material areas that we had in our texture channel. We could also just, because this doesn't have much data in it, we could replace that entirely. And I'm just going to delete this multiply node. We could replace that with just a constant value. So if we hold down 1 while we're in the material editor, we're going to get a one-dimensional constant. If we hold down 2 and then click, we're going to get a 2-dimensional. So this could be good for like a UV coordinate, something like that. If we hold down 3, then we're going to get a 3-dimensional constant. And this is good for colors. So we could double click in here and we could set a color. And then we could use that color inside our material. I'm going to just grab a one-dimensional constant here, drop that into the roughness, and then we've got that roughness modifier there as well. And that's what that's looking like. Great. Now I'm just going to make this a bit bigger while we work. So we might want to start changing the barrel even more. And I'm going to show you 2 ways to start doing this. So one is the simple way with this sort of setup, and then one is the more advanced material attributes setup, where we're going to use different versions of the same material and work out how we can blend them in editor with a few different methods. So what we could do to sort of tint this, maybe if we wanted to tint it red or make it look a bit rusty, is we could, instead of using a multiply color, we could grab a constant that we created before, and we could use a multiply add. And so we've got most of the sort of blend modes from Photoshop here as well. So we could do something like a screen, and we could use a blend screen too. So I'm going to use a multiply add, and we can actually add in an RGB value, which is this gray color. So we can drop that in there, pick our red color here, and then now we're blending this pink sort of red color with our barrel. So that's what that looks like. And we could go ahead and make some material instances as well. So if we wanted to make this tint accessible as part of our material instances, say we're going to have 10 of these barrels and we want them to be different colors, well, what we can do is turn this constant into a parameter by right-clicking our constant and choosing convert to parameter. We can name it tint. Now we can right-click on our material here and we can say create a material instance. We can call this one mBarrel Blue. And let's just create a copy here. So I'll drag out another barrel. We can drop in this one. So that's assigned now, and we can check that down here, mBarrel Blue. And if I double click on that texture, we've actually got this global sort of tint value, and we can change that to a blue color. And now if we come back, we've just quickly changed that one to a blue tint, and this one has got the red tint. And we've done that through just sort of one click in the global parameter, rather than having to go back into our graph and change this one. So that's one way to get some customization going. Okay, so that's one way to set up some variety in our materials, but it's a pretty slow method and it requires us still creating lots of different tints and different variables and constants in here, and then creating different instances. So we should try and find some ways that we can start doing this more in editor, so that when we set up our environments, we can easily paint in or use sort of noise or randomization to create some variety. So one way we can do that is using the set material attributes node. So I'm going to just delete all of this for a sec, and that's going to turn our barrel black. And what we're going to do is create this new node called set material attributes. And you'll see we've got that one selected. We've got an array that's opened up. And what we can do is add some new objects to the array. So I can hit the plus button, and now we've got all these different channels. Now, through those channels, we can start setting up things correctly based on the maps that we've got. So I've got a base color, that's good. I also need my normal map. So we've got our normal, and we've also got our roughness channel. Now we can hook these ones up. So we're going to hook in the base color, our normal, and our roughness. And now what it's looking for is to send this out. Now you'll see that this can't actually go anywhere, because what this is doing is our set material attributes node is packing in all these different textures into one different node output. And so this actually has to go into a special type of input, which will be our material attributes. So what we need to do is change a setting on our material itself, so with nothing selected, and that is just this one checkbox here, which is use material attributes. So we'll tick that one, and now we've just got one plug that we're looking for, and we can hook in our same material attributes, and now we're kind of back to square one, but we're using just one plug to hook up all of these different materials. So far, that looks like a whole lot of work for nothing. But what we can actually do now is we can treat these different set material attributes nodes as different instances of the same material within one graph, and we can start playing with how those blend together. So instead of connecting straight to our output here, what we could do is break that connection, and we can call a get material attributes. And this basically reprints the same different attributes that we've just sent in from our set material, so we just need to create the same paths out. So we'll get our normal and our roughness. So what we could do now is start messing with some of these values, and I might use a reroute node here just to tidy things up. So to do that, what we need to do is double click somewhere here, and then we can reroute things like that. Just helps you clean things up a bit. And what we can do there is we can start playing with the tint and the different options again that we were working with before. So we might want to multiply, add, and grab a three-dimensional constant, drop that in to our red value again. And we might want to do the same with our roughness, so we'll multiply that and we'll choose 0.2. So we've got that one coming out now. We could also add in a different map here. So for example, we could add in emission. So if I draw in another constant, so we'll do a three-dimensional constant, and we'll make it red as well, and multiply that by something high. So emission, we take a regular value and then we multiply it to create an HDR value, and then that gets sort of exported. And then we can create another set material attributes node here and bring in our same elements. So base color, normal, roughness. This time we're also going to be adding emission. And we can start plugging these back in. So now we're going to give it the base color again. We're going to give it the roughness, and we're going to, I might hold off on the emission for a sec. And so what's really nice is that now we've kind of got one version of our material up here, and we can preview that by right-clicking the Set Material Attributes node and hitting Start Previewing. We'll give that a sec. I didn't hit apply. Okay, so now we're previewing that one, and you can see we've got sort of a normal looking barrel there. But then if we right click this one and start previewing this version, there we've got the red glossy version. And if we drop in our emission, it's going to look even crazier like that. So now we've got a very different version of the same material that's over here inside the same material graph. And we're using these 3 texture samples to drive all of that. We don't have heaps of different texture channels coming in here. So what's really nice now is that we can actually blend these 2 textures together. So what we can do is go blend material attributes. So we'll call that, and it's got an A, B. I'm actually going to make this one B and this one A. And then we'll connect that to our material attributes, and we'll stop previewing. So now we're still not seeing much because we don't have an alpha blend yet. So what I might do to just sort of debug that and show you how it works is create a bounding box. And that basically will get the normal values of our model and based on sort of a bounding box around it, and give us different channels. And so I'm not going to use the RGB here, I'm just going to grab the B, which is going to be our Z, and we're going to saturate that and use a cheap contrast. And you don't have to follow this, by the way. This is just purely for illustrative purposes. So we'll crank up the contrast and then we'll drop that in. And so if I preview this, we have to hit apply again. So this is what that looks like. It's black at the bottom and white at the top. And that is being used to drive the blending of our two different materials. So now we've got one that's emissive on the bottom. It's got a kind of glow down there, and then at the top it's just standard, and that updates live, and we've got emissive lighting blasting out from our materials as well. So that's how we can start blending these together, but that's not a very artistic way to blend them. That's just sort of a ugly debug looking way, and I might turn off the emission for this next part. I just wanted to show you how to set that up. So a really good way we can blend these together is using Vertex Painting. So if I search up Vertex Color, I can bring in a Vertex Color node, and you notice this is red because it's going to take in data from outside of this material graph. And I'm going to just plug in one of the different channels here. So I'm going to choose the red channel and plug that into the alpha here. And so you'll notice by default, we've now switched off that other material. But what we can do is come over to our barrel, and if we enter our mesh painting mode, and ensuring that we're on the colors setting here, and choose paint, and we disable these other channels, what we can do is we can start painting that texture in. So if we hold down Shift and start clicking, well, maybe it's not holding down Shift. Where are we going wrong here? Okay, so I just noticed something while doing this live. If you have Nanite switched on, it actually doesn't let you do the weight painting. So I just had to go through and turn off Nanite on my static mesh there. So I went to the barrel, switched off Nanite, and now I can paint in that texture. So I'm just going to make sure that I don't have my emission on because I was using that for debugging. Save all. And so, yes, if we go over to our mesh paint mode with our barrel selected and we choose paint, we can shift click and we can start painting in that other texture. So that's really nice for art. We can start creating some really interesting looks really quickly. And you can imagine with some more contrasting variations inside your node, then you can start creating some different looks. This is also totally independent. So if we go over to this barrel here, which I'll just make sure has the same texture. So this one is the exact same material, same model, but it's actually just doesn't have the weight painting, and we can put in our own weight painting there instead. And so you can imagine this would be really useful if, for example, like we had our barrels in the water and we had them sort of sunken down, and maybe we wanted to make them look like they were wet around the bottom area. So what we could do is we could turn off this multiplier and just go straight out from here, and we can make this a 0.1 value to make it really wet looking. And now all of that immediately updated, so it kept the same sort of path that we already painted. and we could start painting this to look like it was sort of wet around the edges here where it's touching the water. Okay, so that's one way we could start painting in some detail. So you can see we've added in some sort of wet patches, some wet patches all over this model. So the other way we could drive some variety and randomness into our texture blending is using a noise texture instead. So what we could do instead of using this vertex color is grab a sample texture, and here we could actually use really anything. So you can see it's got all these different textures we can use. Just if you're missing some of the options there, like some of the noise options, you might not have your engine content ticked on here. So just make sure you've got show engine content switched on, and that'll let you access all these other folders. Do just be careful in the engine content folder, because if you adjust things here, it actually adjusts it across all of your different Unreal projects, which is quite dangerous. So what we're going to do is search for some sort of noise texture. And what's looking good? Well, this one looks good. This is like a tiling one, so maybe we'll use this. And we can maybe crank up the contrast of this one as well. So we'll just use a cheap contrast and plug in a single constant to increase that. Might be too much, 10. And we'll plug that into the alpha. And now you'll see we've got some random noise driving that. So we've got this kind of bloody look that's happening now. So that's interesting. And then we could also use a sort of 3D noise to make that random dependent on where it is. So this will look interesting for static objects, but probably won't work for things that are moving. But regardless, so what we could do is we could grab our world position, and we've got this absolute world position. So I just right clicked and searched world position. We could mask that, so we just get one channel. So we want the component mask here, and I'm going to divide that by something that's a cubic value, like 1024. Plug that into the UVs. I might lower the contrast a little bit here. Let's see. And maybe this one. Yep, that looks good. So you can see now it is a sort of interesting looking noise because it's got this vertical tearing, because we're actually remapping the global UV, which is a 2D texture. So you can see now we've got this sort of painted look, and if we move things around here, that's changing. So each one of these will look slightly different. So one final thing we'll do on our barrel, so once we've got that kind of positioned, is we might tick simulate physics, and we can do that for both of these. I'm also just going to turn off the absolute world position, so we've just got a static object here. And with simulate physics checked, we can actually add in some mass for our object as well. So if we search up mass here, we could tick that. We can choose a mass, or it's automatically calculated one for us based on the size. And now we've got some objects imported that also can be kind of pushed around. So these ones here, the player can knock about. And that's looking Quite nice. Okay, so that is going to conclude the art and material side of this tutorial. Next, we'll be going through how to do a bit of prototyping in Blueprint to create some interactions. And we might imagine this is like a 3D Donkey Kong spawning some barrels in and interacting with the player in some way. And then we'll also finish up by setting up some UI elements. So now would be a good time to take a bit of a break and reset, and then we'll come back and do some blueprints. Okay, so we've set up an environment with our Cubegrid tool. We've imported some different objects here and played around with the material settings and the physics settings. So next what we're going to do is start prototyping some interactions and animations into our environment. And the first thing we're going to do is use the sequencer tool to create some moving platforms for our different environments here, or our different zones. So what I'm going to do is leave immersive mode here for a sec. And we're going to create a moving platform that will take us across this gap here, which is probably not strictly necessary, but that's what we're going to do. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new platform. So we'll go in and search for a cube, and we'll just grab a cube primitive. And that's actually a really good location already. We'll just adjust the size to fit here. Something that's sort of challenging, maybe that. All right. And what we're going to do is set this where we want it to start moving from. So we'll go with that, and I might also just give it that same Megascan material that we were using as well. Okay, looks pretty good, and it actually doesn't blend too badly. Great. So now what we want to do is create a sequencer. So you'll notice there's this little film stop button up here. What we can do is add a level sequence in, and we'll drop this inside our levels folder, probably in a new folder called sequences. And we'll call this something boring like prototype sequence. Great. So that's now opened up our sequencer panel, and if we ever accidentally close that, we can just go back to our levels folder and find our sequencer and open that up again. Now what we can do is add anything we want that's in our scene to this sequencer. So we could select our cube here, and we could actually drag it in, and now we can access its transform values straight away from the sequencer. Now we can do that with, I'm pretty sure, anything. So even if we wanted to bring in the whole plane or the light or something like that, we could bring in the light, and then we could start playing with, the intensity of the light and animating that. But for now, we're just going to worry about this one platform. And so we can use this key button here to add a new keyframe at the current position. So we'll do that. And then we're going to move through in time. So we'll say, let's do, this doesn't really matter. 30 frames is fine. So in 1 second, it will move across to this point. So we could add in a second point. And now we've already got some motion between those 2 points. And then we just need to set up a looping keyframe. So I can copy that existing one and go to frame 120, and we can paste that. So it's going to go back to that position. And now to just make sure that that is our entire sequence, we can just drag that down like that. So we can grab these handles, and now we know we're only going to go to frame 120. And we're pretty much done for the purpose of this animation, all we're doing is creating that one platform, but you might want it to loop back and forth. So all we need to do is find our sequencer, which should be inside our level somewhere. And I must have accidentally dropped the sky atmosphere inside itself. I don't know how to take this out. I'll just do that. Yeah. And so we just need to select our sequencer inside our outliner here and come over here and make sure that we've got loop set up. So we'll say loop indefinitely, and we've got autoplay ticked on. With that done, we can save our sequence, and we'll just save all here. And just for debugging's sake, I might just move our player, which is over here, a bit closer so we don't have to run that whole distance every time. Okay, so we've possessed our player, we've got our different barrels and stuff going on here. And then let's just go check that we've got a moving platform. And it looks like we don't. So we need to have a look and see what's happening there. It looks like I just didn't tick autoplay somehow. So let's try that again. And yes, that is going and moving quite nicely. And the physics just work. We can just stand on it, hop off. We still have this problem here where we can't go up this ramp. One thing we could do is just go to our character, open up the blueprint for our character, and if we go to our class defaults here, I believe there's an angle that we can choose here. Yeah, walkable slope override. Oh no, this one, walkable floor angle here. So if we increase that to something like, let's try 65. We don't want to go too crazy, although that's probably too crazy already. Let's see if that helps us out. Yep, that works. So now we can go up and down there. Another thing I do want to mention is I went over to our exponential height fog here, and I turned on volumetric fog, which I've just lost. Here it is, volumetric fog. And now we've got these great light shafts pouring in through that hole in the wall that we created. And we can change how that's distributed as well. So we've added some basic animation into this scene. We've got some things moving around. Next, what we might want to do is create some spawning barrels that might roll down here and kind of block our path getting up here. So I'm just going to delete this one to get that out of the way. So we're going to need a few different components to create this spawner. So we're going to need the blueprint of the barrel itself that will kind of roll around and hit the player. We'll need a spawning blueprint that is going to kind of shoot out barrels at random intervals. And we'll also need a UI to kind of reflect maybe the player's damage or something like that. So to give a bit of feedback to the player as they hit things. So what we can do first is create our barrel blueprint. So I'm going to go over to the blueprints here and create a new blueprint class. And instead of a character, this time we're going to create an actor. And we'll call it BP_barrel. And within the barrel actor, what we need to do is create our static mesh components. So what we'll do is we'll press add here and we'll search for static mesh. And this will be the barrel mesh. And we just need to select our actual barrel here as well. And that's already got our texture applied. Now to make the barrel roll, it'll need to kind of be on its side. So we'll just rotate that one down 90 degrees. And we'll just make sure that, and I'm moving really fast here, so I'm going to scroll down. We just need to make sure that that's nice and centered, so when it spawns in, it's going to be above the ground and rolling, and it can sort of face that way. That's the first part pretty much done. The second thing we need to do is create our actual spawner object. So we'll do the same thing. We'll create a blueprint class, and we'll call it BP barrel spawner. And this one I'm going to actually drop into the scene here. And just so we have something to visualize it using, I'm going to just give it a sphere component so we can see it. So that's what our spawner looks like at the moment, and we would just turn off the sphere later on. So it looks like it's positioned okay. I think what I want to do is make sure that this doesn't have physics of its own, because we don't want barrels hitting into that. We want them to just kind of appear and roll down the hill. So we don't want to simulate physics, and I actually want to go over to our physics here, and we're going to switch off collision. Yeah, down here, collision. And you can see we've got collision presets and all these different layers. And so we can actually just choose that it has no collision at all, and that way it's not going to hit anything and trigger any hit events. Okay, great. So you've already seen the event graph, and we are going to be using that. But another thing we're going to use is to create some functions, and we're going to use the event graph to trigger those functions. So first off, I'm just going to delete everything here, but we are going to bring back our event play. And so remembering that event begin play happens when the game starts, whereas in our construction script, this stuff happens when the object's placed in editor. So it actually happens before game starts, and you can see it in editor, whereas things in the event begin play just happen when the game starts. So the first thing we're going to do now is create a new function. So what we can do is, looking at the functions panel here, we can hit the plus button, and we're going to make a new function, and we'll call it spawn barrel. And we won't do anything with it yet, we'll just leave it like that. And then coming back to our event begin play, now we want to kick off a timer. And what a timer will do is it'll trigger a function based on a set amount of time you enter. So we can say set timer by function name. You can also have timers use other events, but we'll use function name this time. It's a little bit more straightforward to set up. And so the set timer node is just asking for a function name, so we can give it the name we just created, so spawn barrel, and that's going to look for our spawn barrel function on this event graph. So this wouldn't be able to refer to another event graph, it has to be within this one. And then we just need to set an out time, so we'll say every 2 seconds, for example, and just make sure that it's looping. And that's pretty much it for our event graph. So this, every time we go timeout, it's going to reset our timer and call this function. We could also check what value we're getting out of our timer as well, if we wanted to use the numbers for like an on-screen countdown or something like that. Next, we can go back to our spawn barrel, and this is where we'll set up the actual spawning of the barrels. So we're going to grab off this execution plug here, and we're going to search for a spawn actor from class, which is this one here. So here is where we can actually choose any other class that we've got inside our project, and we can spawn an actor based on that class. So here we're going to choose our BP barrel. Now we also need to say where do we want to spawn it at a minimum, and we actually want to spawn it where our spawner is. So we need to get the position and the transform value of our spawner itself. And we can easily do that by dragging off spawn transfer here and just searching get actor transform. And by default, we're going to pull in our own transform and plug that in. All right, and now we can probably test that. So we'll hit compile up the top here, make sure that we've saved everything. What is it asking us to save? A level. Why? Oh, we've got an autosave happening. I don't know why. Anyway, it's fine. So we'll hop back to our lake shoot here. We'll just see if that's working. So we'll hit play. Actually, we don't need to hit play. We'll just hit simulate up here. So we don't have to always possess our character. If we want to see things happening in our game view, we can also hit these 3 dots here and press simulate. And without possessing, it's going to just start playing our game. And so we're just checking to see if that's actually working. And it looks like, interestingly enough, it is spawning the barrels, but oh, they're just tiny and inside. So it's working, but there's still some problems, obviously. So what we might need to do is just scale this guy up. So let's scale that up. What was our scale of these? So these were scaled to 5. Maybe we can do the same. Or, yeah. Let's do 5 by 5 by 5. And let's bring that up a little bit. The other thing we need to do is make sure we're simulating physics on these so they actually move and they don't just stay exactly where they were spawned. Let's see how that goes now. So we'll go simulate again. Okay, there we go. We've got 1 barrel popping in, and so they are coming out. Now we need to fix up the orientation here because obviously we want them sort of rolling down this hill. What I'll do is just add in that sort of helper that we had. So we'll go arrow, and now we've got our arrow helper here. So our arrow helper is saying that we're going to be pointing this way. So what I'm going to do is align this one with the arrow. So we've got our arrow. I had it parented underneath the barrel, so that wasn't working when we rotated it, but that's looking correct now. Okay, great. So they're popping out, but they're not really moving very well. They're kind of dropping down and then rolling wherever they want. So we might want to control that, and we might need to add a bit of force to get them kind of going. So what we can do is come back to our barrel spawner event here, and we can actually add some force to our barrels. So what we're going to do is add an impulse, and an impulse is like a one-off, one-shot application of force in Unreal, whereas an actual force, because we do have like add force, is a constant slower force. So for this case, we just want to get a bit of an initial movement, so we're going to use an add impulse. So I'm going to pull off the return value here, and we're going to search for add impulse. And we've got this option here that's got barrel mesh pre-selected for us, which is great. And so now we've got this add impulse, which is taking our return value from our spawn. So it's saying this one we just spawned, target that mesh, and we're going to trigger the add impulse event. Now the other thing we need to do is give this one a direction. So what we could do is grab a, can we do a make vector? Can. So we can do a make vector, and we can do a multiply, and we can grab some sort of variable. So let's create a variable that's barrel spawn speed. That's quite long, but whatever. So we'll give that a float. We can expose that as well, and that'll make that a public variable, and I'll show you how to access that in a sec. But what we can do is get that number. We can drag it in. Oh, we probably want another make vector, I think. We'll get vector. No. Make vector. Okay, let's make a vector, and then we will multiply it. I don't know if this makes any sense. Let's see. Do that, something like that. Okay, maybe we just skip that. Good. Okay, that makes sense. So we've got this barrel spawn speed amount, and if we compile, we can actually set the default variable value here. So we'll select our barrel spawn speed, and we'll multiply that by, say, 100. And then this might be a little bit of trial and error. I think it's going to be a Z axis, but let's just see. So let's go 100 here and 0, 0, 0. And we can actually control that value that we just created as well here. So if we search barrel spawn speed, we can see that we've got our variable exposed that we just created. So let's start playing, and let's just see if that's the right direction. Okay, so looks like our vector is shooting them up, which is kind of fun. So we did get the number wrong, but this value of 10,000 for our multiplication seems pretty correct. So we can come back to our barrel spawner, and we'll just adjust that. So it's probably going to be this one then, let's hope. Yep, that works. Okay. But that value was obviously way too big. So let's set the default here to be something like this, and see how that's looking. Okay, might still be too high. Let's try just 1,000. I don't know why I'm going back here to change that. I don't really need to. This is probably fine. 800, how about that? Okay, 800 is looking good. So we'll go with that. We now have a spawner that shoots out barrels, and those barrels have a bit of force behind them and sort of go flying. Now, you notice they kind of fly off to one side or the other. One thing that's sometimes nice to have is to be able to control the physics dimensions. So if we go over to our blueprint barrel and we leave simulation mode here, we can also apply some constraints to those values. So we might want to, for example, lock the position on our y-axis, I think. Let's see. And that'll mean that it can't actually go here. It looks like it can't go left or right. So while it's still simulating physics, it's actually taking out one dimension, and it's just simulating them here. But now we're getting this crazy sort of pile up. So maybe we need to design a way for the barrels to die. So let's do that quickly as well. So we'll come over to our barrel graph itself, and we'll go to the event graph. And on event begin play, we can just use a delay. And a duration here is in seconds, so we can just say after 2.5 seconds, when you're done, destroy yourself. And now we're playing, they shoot out, and then just as they sort of go to hit the wall, they die. It's perfect, so we've kind of made an obstacle there. So you've got a barrel spawner which is shooting out barrels, and those barrels are now dying. Now what happens when we actually interact with it? So I'm going to go back to my player view here, and let's see what happens. So we've got our moving platform. Wait for that. Oh no. That's why I make games. I don't play them professionally. Okay, so you can see, well, they do have physics and they take a bit of effort to move. If we're actually in motion, they don't affect us at all. And that's because the character code by default just overrides all physics interactions, and instead we sort of end up pushing things. So what we might want to do is have these barrels launch us instead, so that when we contact with them, something happens to us. So we can add some launch to these barrels by coming over to our event graph once again. And first we just need to go back to our class defaults here, and we need to tick something called generate, where is it? It's under physics somewhere. Okay, sorry, I didn't have my barrel mesh selected here. So under our physics tab, we've got our, simulating physics. We've got our mass, which we could also pick. But we want to tick this one, which is called simulation generates hit events. And this is where we're going to start using our event graph to reference other sort of classes and objects. So what we're going to do is create a hit event. So we'll say event hit. And so this event will be called anytime the actor hits something else. So when it bumps into something or blocks it. And what we're going to do is get the other object that we hit and drag off that node. And then we're going to cast to player. And you'll start picking up how this works, but often times we're going to be casting from one object to another. So we're going to be finding that other object within our scene and adjusting some of the values or applying something as if we were that object. So I'm going to choose cast to, and it's going to be my FPS controller. So cast to BP FPS controller. And that was just the name of my FPS here. And then as that controller, I'm going to launch character, which is just a preset part of the character code, which just applies like a launch physics to the character. And this exists because the regular character code just overrides physics events. So we need something like this to kind of fake it in a way. And so our target as self, we actually need to grab our FPS controller and block that in there. And then we also need to know how and which direction we're going to launch ourselves. So we could just connect our hit normal here. And I don't know why this is so big. Let's get a bit more space. So we could connect our hit normal to our velocity here, and that's going to kind of move us in the same direction as where we hit on the barrel. But what I want to do is actually invert that and increase how strong that is. So we're going to do the same thing we did before, where we're going to grab a new variable and we're going to name it launch strength, and that'll be of the type float. So we'll drag that in, we'll say get launch strength, and again I'm going to compile and just give this a preset value. So let's try 100 to start with, and then what we're going to do is make a vector again. So we'll make a 3D vector. We'll hook up our launch strength float to that. So we've got a 3-dimensional value, which will be 100, 100, 100. I'm actually going to make this a negative 100. So we invert our hit normal. And then we're going to use a multiplier to just multiply these together. So we're going to take whatever normal value is here. We're going to multiply it by another vector, which is by negative 100 by negative 100. So all of these should invert and be multiplied by 100. And then we're going to make that the launch velocity. So let's test that out now. So if we run into one of these these barrels, what happens? So can't really tell. I think the strength of our launch. Whoa, there we go. Might not be strong enough. Let's see what happened there. So we might have to just tweak the numbers a little bit here. So we'll go back to our barrel spawner, and I'm just going to crank that up by another 10. Oh no, that's the wrong thing. 1,000 is fine. This one, the launch strength. So we'll crank that up to 1,000. So now we're getting sort of smacked back by the barrels as we hit them, and it's a little bit unrealistic, but that's fine. So that's working okay there. Now we might want these barrels to also cause our player some damage, and so that, you know, even though we're getting knocked back, there's a little bit more challenge or something for the player to be aware of as they're trying to traverse this really intricate platformer. So what we're going to do is make another modification to our barrel here, and maybe we can just do some comments to make this all clear. So this is a hit event launch, and this is our self-destruct. And so we're already kind of getting our FPS controller here, which is great. What we're going to do is actually add in another event, or another part to our event graph, and that will be called apply damage. And we will trigger that after we launch the character. So we'll just drag that in here. And so we can set a damage value here. So I might choose something like 10 damage. And so essentially what this is doing is when we if the barrel hits our player, it's going to find the player that it just hit. It's going to launch the player, and then it's going to, as that player, so we've got that connection here, and maybe I'll reroute this so you can see that a bit better. And I just did that by double clicking, by the way, on the line. You can just create some organization. So as that player again, we're going to apply some damage. We're then going to go over, and I'll compile that, back to our player, and we're going to add in a new variable, and it's going to be called player health, and we'll set that as a float again. So I'm going to drop that in, and we're going to get the player health, and then we're going to add in a new event to our event graph, which is going to be on damage. No. Damage. Here we go. Event any damage. And here we can start doing some things. So we basically want to set this player health. So our player health by default, let's compile that. Our player health by default is going to be 100. And this could really be any value, but we'll go with 100 health. And we want to, when we take damage, we want to set the player health to be the player health minus the damage we took, right? So we're saying whatever the player health is now, minus whatever damage we took, set that to be the new player health. And if we wanted to see what that's doing, we could then debug that. So to debug that, we could search out here, and we could search for, is it debug? No, it's print. We need a print. We need to print a string, and we're going to hook that up. And luckily, we've got a nice float to string conversion. And so every time we take damage as the player, and let's comment that, player take damage, we're going to set the player health to be whatever the player health was, minus the damage, and then we're going to print that to our console. So let's test that out. And so the console will just appear in the top left here, so you can see that read 90 when we got hit once, 80, 70, 60, 50, 40, 30, 20. Now we're in the negatives. So there's not really any punishment. We're just sort of receiving damage. So now that we know that that's working, we could create some more odds and actually reset the scene when we take too much damage. So I can delete these ones, and what we can do is create a branch, and that's kind of like an if then sort of statement, if or whatever. So we'll create a branch here, and a branch will check a condition, and then it'll either be true or false, and then it will do something based on that. So what we can do is pull out our player health value that we've just set, and this is kind of the return value, and we can check if that equals, and I just did 2 equals sign. It's going to do an equals operator, and we're going to see if it equals 0, so that's already perfect, and we'll drop that condition here. Let me just drag that out so you can see what that's doing. So we're now exporting our new value after we minus. We're going to check if that equals 0. If it does equal 0, then we're going to open level and just give it the same name as the level we're in now. So that level is Lake Chute. Great. And one thing I am going to do just to make this a bit quicker to debug is I'm going to just drop in a barrel down here. Oh no, it's going to despawn. I'm going to move my player. Okay, so now we're right in the right spot here, and we can take damage. That should be 20, 30, 40, 50. We might have been hit multiple times. There we go, and it kind of reset the scene there. Okay, so by this point, I hope you've got a pretty good idea of how to use actors and how to reference other actors and make them sort of interact. We've prototyped a few different interactions now. So we've got our blueprint of a barrel. We're spawning that barrel in using a spawner blueprint and then applying some physics to those barrels. We're then creating some interactions with the player where we're causing damage to the player and we're launching that player when it gets hit with a barrel. And we're also resetting that scene when we hit 0 health. So we're starting to tie some of these mechanics together and build a kind of game experience. What we might want to do is now give the player a little bit of feedback that's a bit nicer than a debug console, so that they can track how their health is going, and this will be kind of the final piece of the puzzle for today's tutorial. So what we want to do is create a new UI, what's called a widget, and we're going to use that widget to create our health bar. So to create a new widget, we just need to go over to the add button here or right click in our empty space and go down to user interface and choose a widget blueprint. And we'll just pick this common option for a widget blueprint here, a user widget, and we'll call this BP player HUD. All right, and we'll open that up. So when we open up the blueprint player HUD, we're going to see this new view, which we haven't seen before, which is the designer. And you can switch between the designer and the graph view of a UI up here in the top right. So in the designer, we can actually kind of get our UI canvas and we can start laying out our different pieces that make up our UI. So the first thing we always need is a canvas, and this lets us just do sort of basic anchoring and scaling. So in my palette of options up here, I'm going to search for a canvas, and I'm going to drag that into my hierarchy down here. And these are kind of like Photoshop layers, so they kind of get nested on top of each other. And so within this new canvas, I'm going to first just set the screen size to be like a 24-inch monitor size so that we've got a nice sort of standard screen size to work with. And then within that canvas panel, I'm going to create a couple of boxes. And if you've done any HTML, these are like divs basically with a bit more responsive scaling built in. So we can create horizontal box and we'll drag that into our canvas, and we can also create 2 vertical boxes, and those will go inside our horizontal box, but they're not going to be nested. So just notice here we've got 2 vertical boxes and then our horizontal box. And you can see when we select anything that's like a top level object within our canvas, we get this anchor. And so this sort of flower just basically lets you choose where this is anchored to in screen space. So if we want to anchor this into the top left, we want to just pick this one here. We'll just click that and that'll anchor that canvas panel to the top left. And then if we imagine this is a 16:9 screen, we can pick our horizontal box to be about might be too big, something like that. And that's just saying that we want all of our content to appear in this area, and we might give a little bit of padding there. So this is the area for UI on the screen. And then within our 2 vertical boxes, we can start pulling in some different elements. So the first one we might want is like a label for our object here. So we just need to select our vertical box here and choose fill. And then I've plugged in a text block here and dropped that underneath my vertical box. Actually, this should be auto. This should be fill. Great. So on our text block, I'm going to just make this a label. So we'll say health. And that looks a bit gross, but we could, play with the different fonts and stuff here. It looks like we've got some Google fonts, which is, it's kind of nice. And we could change the padding and everything here. And then in our second vertical box, I'm going to add a progress bar. And so we'll drag that in. That's just one of these common elements. This one we will choose fill. And we're just going to make sure that our vertical box is also filling the space there. So maybe that should be auto. Not sure. Okay, that's looking good. So we've got our health. We might need to add a bit of padding as well. So if we open up this here, we can start playing with the padding values. So I've just selected my text, unwound the padding, drop down here, and we can add some padding to the right, just so we're not butted right up against that object. And I'll just stretch out this box so we've got a bit more real estate to play with our health bar, although that is probably too much. I think our health text is too big. Let's drop that down to like a 24. Yeah, that'll work. Great. So we've got our health bar set up. Now we actually need to spawn in the health bar. So to do that, we could drop that into our FPS controller here. One thing that's kind of nice to know is that we've got blueprints for our actual level as well. So I might do this inside the level blueprint. So if we're back in our level view and we click this little blueprint button up here, we can press open level blueprint. And on begin play, what we need to do is just call a create widget. And then we need to say which widget is it going to be. It's going to be our player HUD. And that is all we need, I believe. Let's just have a look there. So we'll hit play and just see if we've got our HUD happening. Doesn't look like it. So let me just troubleshoot that a little bit more. Add to viewport. Let's try that. There we go. So I just missed one, which was adding to the viewport. And so now we've got a health value in a big bar on the screen, but you'll notice it's not really doing anything at the moment. So what we'll need to do is create some setup for our health bar to actually follow the value of the health from our player. And you can see this is what it should look like as it goes up and down. So to do that, first we need to get a reference to our current player. So to connect our health bar value here to the health of our actual player, we need to first get a reference to that player. And because we need a specific instance of our player, we can't just cast it. We need to actually pull in the specific one. So what we're going to do is go over to our graph here. So we're still on our player HUD. We're just going to the graph tab. And we're going to add in something on the event construct here. So when our actual HUD is first sort of spawned in. And what we're going to do is cast to player. So we are starting off with a cast. And then we're going to say get player character, and that's pulling off this object pin here. So get player character. And now we're saying get the player character of 0. So that's good. We've got the correct one. And then as the player character, we're actually going to drag off here and say promote to variable. And we'll just rename that this FPS controller. And so we're setting a new variable called this FPS controller to be the current player that we're playing as in the 0 index here. So that's good. Now we can go back to our designer here and we can choose our health bar once again. And what we need to do is actually bind this percentage value to a function. So we'll say create binding, and that's going to open up a new function here called get%, and we'll just rename it get health from FPS, something like that. And what we're going to do here is drag in our FPS controller. So just hold Control space and click and drag that one. And with our character, we're going to drag off here and say get health. And this is actually the player health value that we set up way back on our object here. And we might make sure that's public. I'm not sure if it matters, but we'll do it anyway. So we've got player health, that's public. We'll come back here, and then we just need to turn this into a percentage if it's not already, and we can do that by doing a simple division. So we'll drag off this, we'll put in a slash for divide, and we'll divide the number by 100, and then we'll export that out as a return value here. And so, if we play again, now our health bar is full. And when we get hit, oh, we just took 2 hits, that's dropping down. And then we can see, once we hit 0, that our scene is refreshing. Okay. So we've now got a spawner shooting out barrels that cause force and cause damage to the player, and a health bar so we can track the player's health as they play around in the environment. So that concludes the blueprint and prototyping portion of this tutorial. The last thing I wanted to do is show you how to build your work into a standalone, because you might be wanting to start publishing this on Itch for your folio piece. So what you need to do is actually just go over to this platforms tab up the top here and choose the platform that you want to build for. So in this case, we'll do Windows. And then all we need to do is choose package project. Now, before you do that, there is one thing you need to check, and that's if you go to edit project settings. And we just need to search for the default game, and we've got this game default map setting here, and we just need to choose which map we want that to be. So that's Lake Chute there. Okay, so we're going to go up to platforms here and choose Windows and package project. Now I'm getting this warning and I'm not entirely sure why, but I'm just going to ignore it and hopefully we won't have a problem. And I'm still getting this thing where it's making me save all my auto saves, but that shouldn't be happening to you. And then we will just drop that in somewhere. So I'm going to say Unreal Shoot level, and we'll select that folder and we'll let it build away. So you can track the progress of that build, and we'll just let that go. So thanks everyone. I hope to see some really interesting stuff in your experiment folios for week 2. There should be a lot for you to learn from in this tutorial, and I hope you can find some interesting ways to recombine all the different programming and art skills that we learned today.